are actually ready to start. Happy Monday. We've gone through this class several times, and every time I do it, actually I learn more. So anyway, I pulled up the residential purchase contract, and just to kind of back up a little bit, when you're going to write a purchase contract, number one, I love it if you know everything that it says in there. And the other thing, whenever you start a purchase contract, you want to go into command first and put your buyers in as contacts, and then do an opportunity. And once you pull up the opportunity and start in that, then it gives you the choice. You can do .loop or you can do DocuSign, whichever one you want. So here we are at our purchase contract. And the reason I keep, talking about the purchase contract is because when we represent the buyer, it's really important we know every word in there. And also, if we represent the seller, it's so important that we know what's in there. Because, in the contract, it says so many times, oh, if this doesn't happen, if you don't get the loan commitment, you get your earnest money back. And we know that everything still has to go by paragraph 12, and then it states the purchase contract. So anyway, and as we go along, if you have questions about anything, I am more than happy to answer. So let's start at the beginning. Oh, maybe I'll sing. So anyway, put in the, the address, and want to back up again. When you're in command and you start your contract and you're putting in all the information, there's a thing there. If you just put in the multiple listing number, a lot of stuff will populate into your contract. So you want to fill that in, you want to have your buyers in, you want to have their email addresses in there. And once you have it all ready, then you can actually do the purchase contract. And before you write this contract, I hope that when you first met with them, that you had the proper paperwork signed. So anyway, we start at the top with the address, and then going on down, and see if you've already put in the multiple listing number, the tax parcel number, and the county will go ahead and populate in there. So put in your purchase price. I just wrote a contract today, which is kind of nice because my mind's a little bit fresh. So put in your purchase price, whatever it is. And then when you get to additional terms and conditions, like today, for instance, one of the things I put in there was the clause about the post-closing possession. And if you want, I think my screen's little, but okay. So you see where I go up there and it says add a clause. So if you do that and say you want to do number 1, additional terms and conditions, you can just add that in. Hold on a minute. So if you're going to do that, you have to have your cursor in 1.1. So let's go back up there. Where is it? Add clause. We're going to do additional terms and conditions, and you add. So there we go. And it's in there. Now, here's another little pointer in additional terms and conditions. Sometimes you have a lot of stuff in there. If you want to make that print smaller so you can get more in there, you just, highlight what you want to do, what you want to make smaller, go up there to the font size and make it 8 point. You can't read it, but anyway, that's how you can get more verbiage under 1.1 additional terms and conditions. Any questions? Good students today, thank you. Under attorney approval clause, I would say that most contracts that are written do not have an attorney approval clause. I always put 2 days in there, just in case I find out we do need it. So to me, just, better to be safe than sorry. Under financing, if it's cash, you can just, put their initials in. And well, let's see if I can, well, I can't really assign it to anyone because I don't have any people in there. But anyway, so you would click it on the initial, and then you would go up to assign, and then you could click somebody to put in there. And again, if you put all of your information in at the beginning of the purchase contract, when you get to page 2, premises address, that address will be filled in there. So under lender pre-qualification in this market, I would have the buyer initial the first 2, and just as you have delivered the lender pre-qualification, because honestly, when you write the contract, you should have that pre-qual letter ready to send with the contract. Now, if you don't, go over to this one and initial that and say you would have it like within 1 day or 2 days, make it a very short time period. Loan application, if you're writing a contract today, I would probably put 2 days, to get for them to make their loan application. Now, in this section here, 3, it just says that the buyer shall cooperate and provide all the information to the lender. And in bold print, it says, failure of the buyer to deliver the lender's written notification within 3 calendar days following buyer's receipt therefore constitutes a waiver of buyer's right to terminate the contract due to the buyer's failure to obtain financing. So it's in bold print, and make your buyers understand they have to cooperate. They have to get the information into the lender. 3.2 under loan commitment. The loan commitment just says that according to the lender, they should be able to obtain that loan. So if you're going to have a closing within 30 days, I would put that loan commitment to be like 25 days at the very most. Appraisal contingency. If you don't have an appraisal gap clause in there, you would go by 3.2. And it says, the property is appraised or otherwise valued for loan purposes if it is for less than the purchase price stated herein, the buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract by written notice to the seller or seller's broker within 5 calendar days after the buyer receives a copy of an appraisal, with a cut appraisal. So at that point, if they want out of the contract, they have to give written termination, again in bold print, within 5 calendar days. Sometimes when you get a cut appraisal, you might try to renegotiate with the seller and have them come down, you go up or whatever. Demand for financing evidence, and I'm going to look at my little sheet here. It says, if the seller does not receive the buyer's written notice or documents as required in paragraph 3.1, the seller may at any time until 7 calendar days before the closing date set forth in paragraph 15.1, notify the buyer or the buyer's broker in writing that seller has not received the required financing evidence. And basically, they can just cancel the contract. So again, make sure your buyer understands when this information has to be given to their lender. And also, you really have to make sure your lender does his due diligence to make sure, that you get the loan commitment in time. There's just a lot of ifs in this contract. Paragraph 4 under taxes and assessments, basically that just says, the taxes will be prorated to the date of closing. And also in big print, it does say, buyer and seller understand that real estate valuations may be subject to retroactive change by governmental authority. And, we do know that. Then it says, seller shall pay your credit at closing all delinquent taxes, including penalty and interest. And again, if you represent the seller, make sure they realize that their taxes are usually a year in arrears. So make sure they understand that. And then make sure your buyer understands that because they always are in arrears, at the closing, he will be given a credit for the time that the buyer owns, the time that the seller owns that property. So just make sure that the buyer understands they're not paying for any of the seller's back taxes. Okay, let's go down to 4.2 about community development charge. And again, you need to understand what this is so you can explain it to your buyer and or your seller. So if the property is in, say, Gulf Village or New Albany or some of these areas that when the developer developed the area, they put in a community development charge, which is in with the taxes. So again, you need to be able to understand it and explain it to the buyer. And then also, if you're out on a listing presentation, again, if you're listing something in Gulf Village, you have to make sure that you get the proper information from the seller. He may not have it. You might have to go to the tax auditor, but you have to be able to fill in, the county, the volume where it's recorded at the courthouse. Oops. Under fixtures and equipment, make sure with your buyer that you go through these items. And for instance, the contract I'm writing today, down where it says curtain rods and window coverings, excluding draperies and curtains, make sure the buyers know that all those curtains or drapes they sold there do not stay with the house unless you ask for them. So if you want the drapes and curtains down here and including the following, you would say, like all draperies and curtains. And then also in that section, you want to put in, like for instance, the kitchen appliances, you might say range, refrigerator, dishwasher, and microwave in kitchen has been viewed on 8/15/2021, so they don't like change out anything. And then also, because it says about bathroom mirrors someplace, attached mirror, it says attached mirrors. So if a mirror is hanging on a nail or whatever in a bathroom, it's not attached. Again, when I write in and the following, I put all bathroom mirrors. because I'm not gonna go through and see if they're built in or they're on a hanger, so. And over here where it's like TV, where's that saying? TV antennas, excluding televisions and other audiovisual components. And again, just make sure, because a lot of houses we sell today on the finished lower levels, you know, they do have theater rooms and everything. So if that's in there, make sure you write everything in. The following shall be excluded. If they have an old rusty swing set, you don't want to put in there. Make sure the sellers get rid of it. And if they do want a swing set that's in the yard, make sure they include it in there. I just had somebody, an agent called me, in the listing, it said, the swing set in the yard remained. And so he didn't write it in. Well, it turns out the seller took it because the buyer didn't ask for it. So just because it's said in the listing contract, it stays, be sure you write it in anyway. Like even in the listing contract, it says range, refrigerator, microwave, you know, dishwasher, whatever. Those are all checked off. But you know what? If you don't write them in, you know, maybe the seller will go, well, they didn't ask for the refrigerator, I'll just take it. So, and then you might be buying a refrigerator. Okay, inspections and tests. And so again, we really do recommend that our buyers, you know, do get an inspection. And it says in here, okay, it says in big print, the broker further recommends that inspections and tests be performed by a home inspector duly licensed by the state of Ohio. And now they've made that like one of our laws with the Ohio Realtors. It does have to be a licensed inspector, period. Eventually, they'll put that in the contract. Under 6.3, under your specified inspection period. So if you put in 10 days, today is August 16th. So your first day would be August 17th. So I swear I have to count the days on my fingers just to make sure I'm correct on that.
Could we go back to number 1 for a minute, please?
Number 1, what?
I'm a little confused on the bold print.
Oh,
Or with respect to specific components or conditions performed by a qualified person who is exempt from home inspector licensure requirements
what?
pursuant to.
Oh, 6.1.
Yes. Like a licensed plumber, is he exempt from the, I don't know who that's talking about. I think it's confusing.
Let me read that. By a qualified person who, is exempt from home inspector licensure. Actually, I think let me think who would fall under there. I can't think who would be exempt. Anybody on the call that can think of somebody? Because an electrician, I mean.
Okay, I'm with you. I think it's just confusing. It's poorly
Yeah,
written.
it is a little bit confusing. I agree. Yeah, can't think of anybody. Look, yeah, maybe. No, I can't think of anything. So you put in 10 days, 8 days, whatever, and make sure you know when that 10 days is up too, because I'll be very honest. Every once in a while, an agent miscounts. And they end up paying for something. And actually, I've done it myself. So, you know, I always have this story. One time, actually, I sold a house over in Ballantrae. I had the inspection done and had a hard time getting the inspector, but we got it done. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I thought, oh my gosh, I missed the deadline. So I paid for a couple of things. So anyway, so just make sure you know when it's up. And so the buyer at buyer's expense shall have the right and is strongly encouraged to have any and all inspection tests or reports conducted, including but not limited to the following. And so I won't read all those off, but these are all your choices. And including G, which is, you know, if they have a well and a septic, you want to be sure and get those done. And if your buyer chooses not to have any inspections, you know, I now have this hold harmless form document that is in our forms. And I strongly encourage you to do it now. And on September 1st, it will be a required document. So if you don't have it signed, you won't get paid until you do. Because, you know, right now in this market, people are buying houses, they're not having inspections. And then something comes up, you know, they're gonna say, well, guys, Joan, why didn't you like really impress upon me that I really, really should have had this done? So now we have that whole harmless form. It's in there, use it. So 6.4, if the buyer is not in good faith satisfied with the condition of the premises, the buyer has the right to, in the agreement, go ahead and ask for, you know, repairs to be done. And that has to be delivered to the buyer's agent within that 10 days. Now, the buyer and the seller, so the seller can have, you might put, let's say you put 5 days. 5 days after the end of the inspection period to reach an agreement if the seller is going to do any or all of the items that you've asked to be done. And just for your timeline, that 5 days does not take place until after the 10 days is up. So if you got the request to remedy within 7 days, that seller still has 5 days from the end of the 10 days. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. I'm looking at Bev because she's in the class with me. Thank you, Bev, for being here. So let me just we're talking about if they don't reach an agreement, and the last sentence says, upon termination of the contract under this provision, the earnest money deposit shall be returned to the buyer pursuant to paragraph 12. You know, anytime it talks about the earnest money being returned, it always says pursuant to paragraph 12, because, and particularly again in this market, you know, a buyer can have an inspection done and the buyer terminates the contract because he didn't like the fact that there was a small leak in the corner of the basement or something. And then the seller goes, well, that's always been there. It's never been a problem. I'm not returning his earnest money. So again, make sure your buyer understands that it's always pursuant to paragraph 12. And if you're going to terminate the contract based on this home inspection, you have to do a termination in the contract, a mutual release, and you can send the whole report or of the home inspection, or you can just send the part of the report that pertains to the reason why they're getting out of the purchase contract. No questions, good. And also, if you have not collected the earnest money yet, because it was to be collected, after the end of the home inspection remedy, whatever. So do the mutual release, put a 0 where it says the earnest money, because we don't have it yet, but still do your mutual release. Big print, failure of the buyer to deliver written notice pursuant to paragraph 6.4 constitutes acceptance of the condition of the premises and shall be a waiver of the buyer's right to terminate pursuant to this provision. So if your buyer has that inspection, you go, oh, I think it's okay. On the 11th day, that buyer, they call you and go, you know what, we changed our mind. You know, the fact that it said there was that wet thing in the basement, we're not gonna buy it. Well, too bad, we're past that, so. 6.5 homeowners association document provisions. This is, if it is a condominium, the seller has to provide all the information that's required in this contract. And if it is an HOA, then they need to provide that information. And again, this is really good, again, if you're working with a seller, when you list the house, this is all of the stuff that they need for the listing, which is in our purchase contract. This is more towards a condominium, but there is a review period, and within 5 days. And again, if nobody objects, you just assume they are okay with it. No questions, guys, good. Number 7, under warranties. I personally like to present a couple home warranties to my buyer and kind of let them make that choice. And today I was doing a home warranty, and I did call the person with the home warranties because the house I'm writing on today has a well and a septic. And so I wanted to see what it cost to cover those 2 items. And basically, I think it was $75 extra for a well pump. And I think it was like $85 to guarantee the septic system. Item 8D just says that the seller shall convey to the buyer a marketable title. And if they can't, then again, that could be a problem. And maybe it could be worked out with the title company, but that's what the seller has to do. Title insurance, again and again, you're explaining this to your buyer. So title insurance, and you just tell them the seller shall furnish and pay for the ALTA homeowner's commitment and title insurance. And then explain to them, you know, now, if you're working with buyers that have bought before, they probably understand. But if you have a brand new buyer, just tell them that, you know, basically it covers the title to the house, and should something come up from previous owners that would cause a cloud on the title, and you've got that title insurance and it should cover it. Um, 9.2, this is really important if you have the seller. Seller shall deliver or cause to be delivered to the buyer or buyer's broker a copy of the commitment referenced in 9.1, you know, the title commitment, no later than 15 calendar days prior to the date of closing pursuant to this agreement. So again, here's another timeline, and you want that on your timeline paper. Hopefully use a timeline so you know when all these things are due. So again, if you have the seller, you want to make sure that the title company does get a copy of the title commitment to the buyer. And they usually send it to us and then we forward it to the buyer. But just another timeline, or the contract could terminate. 11.3 really goes in, if there's a title problem and the buyer does not accept it, the contract could be terminated. Sorry, I'm saying, I won't do that again. Number 10, utility charges, condominium charges, interest, rentals, and security deposits. This basically refers a little bit more to rental properties or condominiums. Although utility charges, again, you just want to say to your buyer, the seller, through the date of possession, the seller shall pay all accrued utility charges and any other charges that are or may become a lien on the property.
Could I make a comment on
Yes,
that? Because I've been burned by it.
Uh-huh.
When they call, be sure to call and have the utilities transferred right away and clarify that the payments are up to date. Title insurance does not search utility liens.
That's such a good point, yes. Yeah, that's a great idea. And sometimes, honestly, after closing, buyers will find out that there was a water bill
Typically water and sewer.
that were not paid. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, we are on page 9. In big print, it's strongly recommended that upon discovery of damage or destruction of the premises, the party retain legal counsel. Now, 11.1, risk of loss to the premises and appurtenances occurring prior to closing shall be borne by the seller. And I always say, a really good, for instance, is the house is in contract. The sellers could have a little fire in the kitchen or something, and they get their insurance company to come in and they make it as good as new or better than new, and that's nice. But if something like that happens, they do need to notify the buyer. They would notify the buyer's agent. It could be roof damage or flooding or whatever, but the buyer has to know about it. And then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract if they want. They don't have to buy that house. Maybe they don't want a house that had a fire in the kitchen or whatever. So they do have the right to terminate. Now, if you go down to 11.3, failure by the buyer to notify the seller and or seller's broker in writing within 10 days from receipt of notice of damage or destruction that buyer is electing to proceed pursuant to paragraphs blah blah shall constitute an election by the buyer to terminate the contract pursuant to paragraph 11.2. So again, we just have to explain this to the buyer, and then we have to just, if we get a notice from the seller's agent that this has happened, and then we have to notify the buyer. So I'm kind of going into a little bit more detail today because there's so many places in this contract where it can be terminated, and we need to know every one of them. If 11.5, if buyer discovers the damage or destruction after closing, buyer shall have the right to pursue all legal remedies. So good reason why we do walkthroughs too. Although something could happen the day of closing. Earnest money deposit, 12.1. So just write in there how much you're putting in there. And you can do it like 3 calendar days after acceptance of the contract, or you can do it 3 days after the expiration of the agreement to remedy period. I like the after the agreement to remedy period. And then if the home inspection doesn't go well, you don't have to worry about getting checks, etc. Now, 12.3. I'm gonna get a drink, please. 12.3, if any written contingency is not satisfied or waived, if the sellers fail or refuse to perform, or if the buyer terminates this contract pursuant to any of its applicable provisions, all earnest money deposited hereunder shall be returned to the buyer. If the buyer fails or refuses to perform, the earnest money deposited hereunder shall be paid to the seller. Make sure your buyer understands that. I mean, your buyer has to do his part of making this work. In the event, except as provided in paragraph 3.3, and subject to the collection by the broker's depository, all earnest money deposited hereunder is to be dispersed as follows. So again, subject to the buyer's depository, if we don't have the money in our escrow account, we cannot refund it, so. And sometimes the seller might say, I mean, you're a flaky buyer, they didn't give you the $2,000 or whatever, and they want the money. Well, if we don't have it, we can't return it. So again, you have to make sure your seller understands that. I'm not going to read through all of that, but it basically says that we have to have a mutual release to return earnest money to give it to either party. And again, make sure your buyer understands that. Make sure your seller understands that.
Can I comment again? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
Beth, please.
I keep the phone number for Franklin County Small Claims Court in my cell phone for that reason. Because I explained to them, in the event the seller does not agree to return your earnest money deposit,
Yep.
the courts have ruled that we, as realtors, cannot return that money. We cannot make a legal decision that the seller is entitled to that money. So that money sits. I think there is a way to resolve it now, but it takes forever. But I give them the number for Franklin County Small Claims.
I love that idea. Huh, good idea. I do like that, so I'll do that myself. Because the buyer has that right to say, hey, you know, the seller is being.
And they don't understand why I mean, the contract says if they're not happy, they're out of the contract. They cannot understand, and I don't blame them, why we can't just give them their money back.
Because of this 12 point whatever, so 12.3. We just can't do it unless both parties sign. Um, 13 additional, oh, you know what, I'm gonna back up here to 12.4. It says, except as provided in paragraph 3.3, the return of payment of the earnest money deposit hereunder shall in no way prejudice the rights of the seller, buyer, or broker in any action for damages or specific performance. And so that's partly what Bev was referring to. If the seller's just being a hardhead and won't get it back, the buyer can certainly go to the small claims court. Bev, do you know what that costs to file?
It used to be $65,
Yeah.
but I haven't looked it up for a long
Okay.
time, but it's not criminally outrageous.
No, it's probably about the same. Additional provisions. This contract constitutes the entire agreement, and there are no representations, oral or written, which have not been incorporated herein. Any amendment to this contract shall be made in writing, signed by the buyer and seller. All notices given in connection with this contract shall be in writing, signed by the party giving such notice. Now, I kind of go back to the showing I had on Saturday. Excuse me. The seller happened to be there, and she's a chatty Cathy. And she and my buyers were just talking about all this stuff. And she goes, yeah, we're gonna leave that, we're gonna take this. So anyway, before I wrote the offer, I had to go through all of my notes to make sure what the seller said that I could ask for in the contract, because I didn't want it to be, we get to the closing, they move in, and my buyer goes, well, Joan, you heard them, they said they were gonna leave, blah, blah, whatever, so anyway, again, everything has to be in writing. Anything that happens after you get your purchase contract accepted, if anything comes up, if anything changed, say for instance, the seller says, you know what, we've changed our mind, we're gonna go ahead and leave that extra refrigerator in the basement. Okay, if they say that, get an amendment to the contract and put it in writing. I don't know, under signatures, that's pretty self-explanatory, so yes. 13.7, I've talked about this before, the Ferpta Act. And that's when the seller is a foreign investor. If he does not have the proper paperwork with the Internal Revenue Service so he can pay income tax, it's something we would want to know at the time of the closing. Because if the seller didn't pay it and he went back to his native country, the IRS is not going to be able to collect from him. And so therefore, they would charge the buyer part of it.
May I comment again? In Florida, at least, and I assume it's a US rule.
It is.
If the person buying the condo or buying the property is going to use it as a personal residence, I believe that tax can be waived.
Okay.
So if they do have that situation, be sure to, there's a price limit. I think it's around $300,000.
You know, that's interesting. And I've been trying to get one of our title company attorneys to do like a little class on this one day, just so that we really understand it, because I think in Columbus, Ohio, we do have a fair amount of like foreign investors, et cetera. 14, notice to the parties, professional advice and assistance. I always say, hey, you know what, I'm a real estate broker, I'm not an attorney, tax accountant, whatever. And if you have questions that are pertinent to any of those things, you should talk to those people. 14.2, I think we all have a good understanding of Ohio fair housing law. And 14.3, residential property disclosure. Make sure when you're writing a contract that you get that, so you can have it signed with your contract. Now, we also know that sometimes there are properties that don't have, they might be exempted, but otherwise, if there is one, get your buyers to sign it. 14.4, under Ohio sex offender registration and notification law. That is something that you explain to your buyer that you do not check that for them. If they want to know, they can go into the Franklin County or whatever county the property is in, go into the county local sheriff's department to find out if there's any sex offenders living around that home, condo, whatever. And the reason we don't do it, you know, I could check it today for a property and tomorrow a sex offender could move in. So we put that onto the buyer if they want to check it out. 14.5, concessions. Just says buyer and seller when we report the, you know, the listing as a sale. We can say it sold FHA or VA or whatever, and maybe the seller did pay some closing costs, etc. Closing and possession, 15. Okay, the contract shall be form and closed on before September the 15th, just, put in the date. And then 15.2, final verification of condition. For that, I usually go like 2 days before, but make sure you go through and try to see if it's the same as it was when they originally viewed it. And the more important thing about that is you want to make sure if there were any repairs to be done, that you check and make sure those were done as agreed. Possession. Seller is entitled to possession through, put a time, put 12 noon, September 17th, 2021. Because if you just put the date, the buyer thinks they can be there at 8 a.m. The seller thinks he can stay there until midnight, so just put a time. And then it says, at the time the seller delivers possession, the premises will be in the same condition as the date of the acceptance of this contract. Normal wear and tear accepted. So hopefully everything's okay. And if not, you call the listing agent and tell them. 15.4, debris and personal property. It says the seller shall remove all of that. And honestly, sometimes they don't. So not a whole lot you can do about it, I guess. Number 16, duration of offer. Say 12 noon, September 17th. Just make sure that put a time, not just a date. And for me personally, I don't want to stay up until midnight to wait for a response. And if you're the buyer's agent, please fill in all of the stuff, names and brokerage and license number and office ID and agent, and then go over to the other side on the seller side. You don't have to put in their name, but put in the brokerage and the license number and ID and the agent. Put all that in, because this, when it goes to the lender or the title agency, it so helps them if they have all that information there. Duration of offer, receipt of offer. If you have the listing, the seller should acknowledge that they do have that contract. I will say right now in this market, a lot of times other agents aren't doing that, but for my agents here, consultants, I love it if you do it. So, do we have any questions? I wanted to go back up to something else here. On clauses. Okay. So if you have a contract and the possession is going to be like maybe 30 days after closing, it can be 45 days after closing in this crazy market. So if you do, we have post-closing possession. I don't know if that filled in up there or not. Oops, let me do it again. I'm sorry, everybody. Because I do want to show it to you. Post-possession closing can be an issue. Okay, so here's your post-closing possession. It just says seller's right to post-closing possession shall expire at 9 a.m. September 17, 2021. Again, put an exact time in there. And it says seller to obtain insurance coverage for seller's possession and liability insurance for injury and damage that occur during seller's post-closing possession. And you know, things can happen. So if you're going to do a possession, please put that in there because it says what everybody does. There's even a section down there, oops, sorry, that says, so it says seller to pay buyers at closing. So if the sellers are going to pay to stay there, that's where you would put that in. So if it's going to be $40 a day or whatever, so it's all in there. And I think it's really important to cover the buyer if they're going to allow those people to stay in there for a month or whatever.
Again, an item that might be added to that because I neglected it is the condominium fee. If they're staying after, we agreed that the seller would pay, you know, all this stuff, but I didn't think about the condo fee and the buyer didn't think about it till after the closing.
Yeah, that's such a good idea.
So condo fee, negotiate it, but if you can get it negotiated.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I hope everybody heard that. If it's a condo, you want to include in there that they would also be paying the condo fee or whatever you work out with your buyer and your seller. That is it, everybody. You know, I just want to say this because in this market where some agents are writing a contract every other day for the same buyer, just make sure your buyer really understands what they're signing. And it just makes it a lot easier for us if there are problems. And again, you know, I'm probably the person that gets the problems. I didn't know.
Jen,
Heather?
show us again where the symbols that we can use to change the font size. It was up at the top, but I don't remember where it was.
Oh, here, I'll show you. So. If I make it smaller, I think that's my problem. Oh, okay. So say, okay, Heather.
Yeah.
If you want to change the font size in 1.1, okay, so you would like highlight all that.
Okay.
And then go up to, here's your font right here,
Okay,
and then just click it.
got it.
How are you getting that row?
Is this up above? Is this there? Because I'm in .loop.
So am I, but I am not. How are you getting that line? No label across there.
Just because I'm in .loop. I'll show you on your computer. I don't know why you're not seeing it, but.
I'm sorry, show me after class, I'm
I'll show
sorry.
you. Okay. You got it, Heather? Yep. Of course
Yeah,
you
I
do.
see it. Thanks.
Any other questions? If not, I'll say bye-bye. And thank you for attending, everybody.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, I'll be here. I'm always here.
Bye.
Thanks for being on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.